Well, hello, everyone. I'm glad you could join me this evening. Just to introduce myself, my name is Joshua Mathen Brown, and I have a PhD in philosophy from the University of Birmingham. And I also happen to be a seminarian at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology here in Brookline, Massachusetts. And this channel is really a space for me to uh, combine my training and my love for studying and thinking about philosophy with also my love for thinking about Orthodox theology. And so hence the title of my channel is Orthodoxy and Philosophy. And this first talk I'm going to give tonight, I'm going to be dealing with the question, what is Orthodox philosophy? So bear with me one moment while I share my screen. We'll get started. All right. So I've split the talk up this evening into three sections. The first thing we're going to do is try to address the question, what is philosophy? It'll be difficult to talk about Orthodox philosophy if you don't first discuss the matter of what philosophy is. Then after that, we'll try to address the question, should Orthodox Christians engage with philosophy? And then we'll conclude by asking the question, what is Orthodox philosophy? Is there anything distinctive about how Orthodox Christians should engage with philosophy, if in fact it's okay to do so? So let's begin with thinking about the more broad general question, what is philosophy? And I want to start with the ancient conception of philosophy. And by means of considering a very important theologian in the Orthodox Church, St. John of Damascus, who not only is responsible for writing a lot of our hymns that we still chant and sing in our services today, but also is responsible for writing some very important works of theology, one of the most notable ones being his work, The Fount of Knowledge, which he completed sometime after 743 AD. This is one of the most significant first attempts at what we today might call dogmatic theology or systematic theology. And it's comprised of 3 books. Now, most people who are, if there's anyone who's actually knowledgeable of Orthodox theology, they'll might be familiar with the third of those books, which is called An Exact Exposition of the Orthodox Faith. In fact, there was just recently a new translation of that book done by St. Vladimir Seminary Press. And I encourage you to pick that up if you don't have it. It's a really good book. However, the entire book actually encompasses 2 other parts that people often aren't as familiar with. The first part being an entire book called the Philosophical Chapters, or Dialectica. It's basically an introduction to ancient philosophy. And he starts with the philosophical chapters because he thinks studying philosophy is the first thing you need to do before you study theology. So he begins there. Then he moves into the next part in which he covers a lot of heresies. And it's, a compendium of like a huge list of different heretical groups that he gives little brief explanations of and summarizes some of their views, because he thinks you need to learn about the errors before you study theology. So before he even gets to an exact exposition of the Orthodox faith, he gives this whole entire introduction to philosophy. And then he talks about all of the different heresies and errors that you can find yourself making, to the modes of thinking that you should avoid before doing theology. So I've got a couple of quotes from the opening section of not only the entire work of the Fount of Knowledge, but also from his philosophical chapters in which he's describing what philosophy is. He begins the entire treatise with this introduction, and he makes this comment. Nothing is more estimable than knowledge, for knowledge is the light of the rational soul. The opposite, which is ignorance, is darkness. Just as the absence of light is darkness, so is the absence of knowledge a darkness of the reason. Now, ignorance is proper to irrational beings, while knowledge is proper to those who are rational. And by knowledge, I mean the true knowledge of things which have being. And then he goes on to explain what philosophy is. He says, philosophy is knowledge of things which are, insofar as they are. That is a knowledge of the nature of things which have being. And again, philosophy is knowledge of both divine and human things. That is to say, of things both visible and invisible. Philosophy is the art of arts and the science of sciences. This is because philosophy is the principle of every art, since through it, every art and science has been invented. We can kind of summarize his thoughts here in these two quotes. First, St. John of Damascus thinks that there's nothing more commendable than seeking and obtaining knowledge. And he thinks that knowledge, this ability to seek and obtain knowledge, is a unique capacity that only human beings have. That's one of the things that separates us from all of the other animals. And here, as I will point out momentarily, he's just following pretty much Aristotle and the entire kind of all of the different ancient schools of philosophy. Most of them share this view that what sets human beings apart from all of the other animals is our capacity, this unique natural power we have to obtain knowledge and understanding. And he believes it's something that we should cultivate. And further, he thinks that knowledge pertains to the way that the actual world is. We can have knowledge of real objects and properties. We can learn about the things around us, what kind of things they are, how they came to exist, what they are for, those kind of questions. And as I said, St. John is really just expressing here the widely accepted ancient conception of philosophy. And these ideas come from the ancient commentators on Aristotle and Plato, sometimes referred to as the Neoplatonists. Figures like Porphyry or Ammonius, to name just a few. In fact, a lot of the sections from this first book, the philosophical chapters, are just pulled, almost some of them verbatim, from works of Porphyry or Ammonius or other such ancient writers, with some modifications. So I think it's good to start with St. John of Damascus here, not only because he's an Orthodox Christian, but also he does a good job summarizing kind of the ancient view, the ancient understanding of what philosophy is. We can kind of break it down like this. So the ancient view takes philosophy to be a unique human activity, as I've kind of explained already. It's the general pursuit of knowledge. It's our attempt to understand what things are, where things come from, how things work, how we ought to live our lives. So it encompasses all the different fields of knowledge that we tend to break apart in the academy today. So everything from theology to ethics to mathematics, medicine, natural sciences, all of that. Philosophy is the pursuit of knowledge in general. We can kind of maybe even simplify this conception of philosophy even further. We can just say that philosophy is humanity's unique natural capacity to ask questions and to seek substantive answers to them. This kind of summarizes all of what I just said a little bit more neatly and concisely. Only human beings have the capacity to ask questions and to seek substantive answers to them. All right, so that's the ancient conception of philosophy. But today, what do we mean by philosophy? This isn't what you're going to find if you go to a university and sit in a Philosophy 101 class. This isn't how we understand philosophy today. So what's happened? How have things changed? Well, skipping ahead here to after the scientific revolution, we see a break happen between a separation between what today we refer to as the natural sciences and philosophy. That ancient view that I just shared with you really doesn't change for a long time, even all through the Middle Ages, until we get to the scientific revolution and we discover the scientific method. And what happens is there's a rupture, kind of a break, a separation between philosophy and the natural sciences. And we start to emphasize the natural sciences. Why? Well, because the scientific method turns out it's really good at answering a particular subset of questions. So before, when we thought about philosophy, we were just thinking about any question whatsoever you could ask, and thinking about our capacity as human beings to seek answers to those questions, whether we're talking about mathematics or medicine or theology or anything else. But now we've discovered this really powerful method, scientific method, which helps us to answer a subset of those questions that we could possibly ask. It does a fantastic job at it. And so people really get on board with this and they get excited about it. I'm speaking in broad generalizations and kind of a simplified, I'm like canvassing over a lot of history really simply, but that's basically the idea. So what kind of questions am I talking about? Well, here's just a short list of some paradigmatic scientific questions that the scientific method is really good at answering. Questions like the following. How do plants convert light energy into chemical energy? What is the chemical composition of water? How far is the moon from the earth? What causes high blood pressure? What are the signs of an impending earthquake? I just kind of randomly selected these questions. These are only a small sampling. Obviously, there's hundreds and hundreds of more that we could put in this list. These questions are the types of questions that the scientific methods are aimed at trying to answer. What do I mean by scientific methods? Well, things like empirical observation. What do I mean by empirical? Well, typically, originally, we think of empirical observation as what we can perceive through our senses. But we can also devise, machines that can help us even perceive things, observe things that we couldn't just do with our own senses unaided. So think about what we've learned about distant galaxies by looking through telescopes, or about atoms by looking through a microscope. Testing, things like measuring, statistical analysis, building and studying mathematical models. This is something we do in physics. You build a model that you think accurately describes how the world works, and then you test it through observations. You try to see if your model accurately describes what we are observing. These kind of methods they're wonderful at trying to answer those types of questions, but those are just a small subset of the types of questions that we could possibly seek answers to. The scientific method is not well suited to answer all questions. And this isn't a slight on science. This is just to acknowledge that science has limits, and that it's really useful and really good and aimed at answering certain types of questions, but not all of the questions. So what's happened then today is we have two different fields. We have science, the natural sciences, which most people are familiar with. More people are probably familiar with natural sciences than philosophy today. But we have what we call philosophy today, which is concerned with questions that the scientific method alone by itself is not well suited to answering. Now, this doesn't mean that there can't be overlap and that science can't actually help philosophy and vice versa. It just means that using the scientific method alone will not help you to adequately answer these types of questions, the kind of questions that philosophers are interested in. Questions, and this is just a list. Again, this is just a small sample of the types of questions that philosophers are interested in. Questions like, why does something exist rather than nothing? Do abstract objects like numbers exist? What's the difference between knowledge and mere belief? What is the meaning of life? What does it mean to live a good life? What makes an action right or wrong? These types of questions can't be answered by just utilizing the scientific method. And these are the kind of issues that philosophers are concerned with. So you can think about philosophy today as really, it's not quite that much different from how we conceived of it in the ancient world. It is a unique capacity we have to seek answers to questions, but today it tends to be just the questions that the scientific method is not really aimed at answering. There's still important questions. There's still questions that we should seek answers to. We just can't use science by itself to answer them. We need to use the tools and methods of philosophy. So that gives you kind of a basic understanding of what we mean by philosophy in the ancient world and today. There isn't, a nice, neat definition of like philosophy is the study of that everyone agrees on, but we can think of it in these terms kind of pragmatically. And well, what are we doing when we do philosophy? We're trying to answer questions. We're trying to find knowledge. But how does it differ from science? Well, it's focused on the small subset of questions, the types of questions that science is not really able to answer by itself. So, should Orthodox Christians engage with philosophy? That's the next question we have to answer tonight. Well, some people might be uneasy about the idea that Orthodox Christians can be philosophers or do philosophy, engage with philosophy. And there's reason for that we can find in the Orthodox tradition. I'm going to highlight some of those, not all of them, but here are some significant examples that people might look to. They might point to these examples and say, well, this is a good reason to be really suspicious of philosophy or to eschew philosophy completely. We're going to start with this quote from St. Paul from 1 Corinthians. He says, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will thwart. Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men." So someone might read that passage and think, well, St. Paul is kind of talking very negatively about human wisdom, the wisdom of the Greeks. Well, what is that maybe referring to? You might think he's referring to Greek philosophy, pagan thought. Here's another example. So St. Gregory Palamas, who has had a really big impact on the Orthodox thinking, especially in the early 20th century and beyond, a kind of a rediscovery of his work has had a huge and tremendous influence on the way Orthodox think about theology, and especially sometimes the relationship between theology and philosophy. He actually has a short treatise he wrote called "The Philosophy Does Not Save." And in that work, you can find some things that sound kind of negative about philosophy that might lead one to think, oh, philosophy's bad, it's incompatible with Christianity. In fact, he kind of echoes here St. Paul and indeed quotes St. Paul, the same passage I just read to you from Corinthians. Gregory Palamas says, "Are we then to say that those pagans who hold such a philosophy possess the wisdom of God or even a human wisdom in general? I hope that none of us would be so mad as to claim this, for as the Lord declared, a good tree does not produce bad fruit. In my estimation, this wisdom is not even worthy of the appellation human, since it is so inconsistent. And he goes on to, after that, he goes on to list a bunch of what he believes to be inconsistent ideas that you find in pagan philosophy, absurd ideas, in his opinion. St. Paul thinks it right, he goes on to say, to call those who have acquired worldly wisdom wise according to the flesh, or wise men become feeble-minded. The disputants of this age, and their wisdom is qualified by him in similar terms. His wisdom has become folly, the wisdom which has been done away, vain trumpery. Okay, so that doesn't bode well for thinking about the relationship between orthodoxy and philosophy. I mean, it sounds pretty negative view that St. Gregory Palamas here is expressing about philosophy. Another significant example would be in the writings of St. Ephrem the Syrian. This is just one example. You can find these kind of statements kind of scattered through his work, which is markedly different from a lot of church fathers like St. Gregory Palamas, for example. It's more poetic and uses a lot of symbolism and metaphor in his theology. But you can find statements like this. I pulled this from the Peal or Seven Rhythms on the Faith. He says, and envy is from Satan. The evil usage of the evil calf is from the Egyptians. The hateful sight of the hateful image of four faces is from the Hittites. Accursed disputation, that hidden moth, is from the Greeks. Okay, so it sounds like here he's comparing what he's calling a cursed disputation, that hidden moth, is from the Greeks. So debating, discussing ideas, theories, seeking knowledge through human wisdom. It sounds like he is comparing that to basically worshiping idols, like we find the Israelites doing as when Moses comes down. He's kind of alluding to that event where Moses comes down from the mountain, having received the 10 Commandments, and he discovers everyone worshiping this calf. And he's saying that comes from the Egyptians, and that's evil. And he's comparing, it sounds like he's comparing philosophy to that. You see kind of statements like this, kind of negative ones throughout his work. So for this reason, sometimes you encounter Orthodox Christians who maybe are averse to the idea of philosophy, or think that somehow it's not compatible with the faith, or that even maybe they think it's evil, or it's very suspicious of it. And it's understandable when you hear things like this or see statements like this, why some people might draw that conclusion. But I think, unfortunately, that's not the conclusion you should draw. And if we take a closer look at the context in which these kind of statements are being made and what they're actually criticizing, it helps us understand that they're not criticizing the fact that we have this capacity to seek knowledge and understanding and answer questions. They're not criticizing the idea that we can draw upon pagan ideas, non-Christian ideas, and thought and science, and helping us understand the world. Let's take a look at why I think that. Well, we need to ask the question, what are these saints actually criticizing when they make these kind of comments? We don't just want to pull them out of context and kind of use them as some kind of proof text to support this idea that philosophy is bad and we should have nothing to do with philosophy. But we need to ask the more difficult question, what are they actually criticizing? Well, they're not criticizing our natural capacity for asking and seeking answers to questions. They're not criticizing our desire as human beings to acquire knowledge and understanding. They're not criticizing learning and education. And they're not criticizing the use of pagan concepts and ideas. So then what are they criticizing? Because it may have sounded like they were to you when I was reading those passages. Well, let's start with St. Paul. What he's criticizing in 1 Corinthians is the notion that the gospel is just a clever philosophical theory devised by human reasoning. St. Paul is pushing back against those in the church at Corinth who were treating the gospel as if it is yet another school of ancient philosophy, centered around a clever or articulate leader and eloquent rhetoric. He's also pushing back against the notion that human reason and understanding can bring about your salvation. So St. Paul is arguing that human wisdom fails to bring us into union with God, for only the Logos of God can achieve this. That's his argument. When he talks about the Logos or Word of God being the power of God, that is what allows us to achieve union with God, to achieve salvation. And this isn't just some cool idea thought up by St. Paul or some other clever person who's well-spoken, who's really good at rhetoric and arguments. But this is different. In fact, you can see that what St. Paul's not criticizing is the use of Greek ideas or Greek thought, because just before, this time frame when he's writing this letter, he's in Athens. You can read this account in the book of Acts. And in Athens, he's speaking to philosophers and he's quoting pagan philosophers. He doesn't quote the scriptures at all in his speech. He uses pagan philosophers to try to get the conversation started, to appeal to common knowledge that they may have shared, talking about the unknown God and talking about the nature of God in general. And then he starts talking about Jesus Christ raising from the dead. And of course, that's the point where some of the people there in the room don't want to listen, because that at that point isn't just philosophy, right? He's talking about revelation. He's talking about the experience of the church who experienced the risen Lord. So that's what St. Paul is talking about in this passage in Corinthians. He's not critiquing philosophy. He's not saying that all philosophy is foolish or all of it's evil or it's wrong or that we should not have anything to do with it. He himself alludes to ideas and directly quotes from pagan thinkers in his letters. And even some of the things he does and says, as we've learned through contemporary scholarship, actually mirrors or images things that other moral philosophers would have done during his lifetime. And he obviously had an incredible education. He was a very learned man, so he wasn't against education, and God used that. In fact, St. Peter, even kind of one of his epistles, talks about Paul's writing and how dense it is and how difficult to understand. So St. Paul had a unique vocation. He had a unique training and a calling that God used. And he couldn't have written the epistles that he wrote and engaged in the kind of dialogues and discussions he did without that. So what he's criticizing here is more this idea that you can achieve salvation just by human philosophy and, correcting errors by educating yourself. And the idea that the gospel message is it's just about some new cool idea. And that the person who has the most clever way of presenting it, is the leader you should follow. And St. Gregory is actually, what he's dealing with, what he's criticizing is not terribly different from what St. Paul is. He's criticizing the notion that classical Greek education and philosophical speculation can bring about salvation, and in fact is the only way to obtain knowledge of God. So the people he's responding to in writing this are people who are arguing that you can achieve salvation through education and speculative learning in science. That once you learn, right, for example, what the right thing is, then you'll just, I guess they thought that you would no longer do what was wrong. And that the only way to also have knowledge of God is through this kind of Aristotelian syllogistic type of reasoning. And in fact, the beginning of the treatise, St. Gregory, it really explicitly states this. He describes what he's responding to, the type of view. He's pushing back against those who argue that education not only dispels, and this is a quote from from the same work, not only dispels all other evils from the soul, since every passion has its root and foundation in ignorance, but it also leads men to the knowledge of God, for God is knowable only through mediation of his creatures. So this is the type of view that St. Gregory's writing against. And he responds by arguing that we can have direct and immediate experiential knowledge of God. That's incorrect to think that you can only know about God, only have knowledge of God through mediation of his creatures, which is, in their view, is looking at creation and engaging in some kind of abstract philosophical reasoning to conclude, oh, there must be God. That's the only way to have knowledge of God. St. Gregory is challenging that. He's saying, no, you can have immediate experiential knowledge of God. That's a big point of all of his writing. And this distinction he makes between the essence of God and the energies or activities of God, it's all about that. It's all about religious epistemology, about understanding how we can have knowledge of God. He thinks that we can have knowledge of God beyond just philosophical abstract knowledge. And that's really important to orthodoxy. So that's one thing he's challenging. He notes that our capacity for asking questions and seeking substantive answer to them, what he calls human wisdom, can be corrupted and can lead us into error. And then he points out many absurdities and errors in pagan philosophy. And so, again, what he's not doing is criticizing philosophy full stop, right? He's pointing out that philosophy, or what he's referring to as human wisdom, human knowledge, can be prone to error. We make mistakes, whether we do that intentionally or not. We deviate from the truth. And for him, he's operating in a context where there is certain revealed truth from within the church that he thinks is foundational. And so he's warning his readers that reading and engaging that philosophy, right, can lead you into error. And he points out some of those errors that are contrary to an orthodox understanding of the world. So these are the two big things he's really trying to address. And you can see at the very end of this work, the work I'm referring to here is a philosophy cannot save you. I may be getting the title just a bit wrong there, but something like that. He's arguing and fundamentally that people who are treating philosophy as being your only means of salvation, that you can use philosophy basically to learn how to live a good life, and so stop living in error. And also you can use philosophy to have knowledge of God, and that's your only means of having knowledge of God. And this is how you can be saved. He's equating that to someone who says, by following the Mosaic law, you can be saved. And he kind of concludes the whole thing by saying, just as following the Mosaic law cannot save us, so acquiring knowledge through pagan philosophy cannot save us. So that's his point. That's what he's criticizing. Note that he's not just criticizing the study of philosophy or the use of pagan learning and education. He himself was highly educated. He couldn't have written these treatises if he hadn't been. He understood philosophy. He understood classical learning. And he actually employs many philosophical concepts when he talks about the essence energies distinction, and he critiques the kind of Thomistic view. So it's important to keep this in mind. It's important to ask yourself, what are these saints criticizing when they make these kind of comments? And then St. Ephrem's concerns about Greek philosophy, they're actually not very dissimilar from St. Gregory Palamas's. He's really concerned with safeguarding the ineffability and mystery of God and the experience of God from just this idea of abstract, rational, philosophical theorizing about God. So that's really important for St. Ephrem as well. It's central to a lot of his writing. And contemporary scholars have actually shown that St. Ephrem did, in fact, employ many philosophical concepts and motifs in his work, even though it's more poetic. And there are some of his works that are not works of poetry. And I just want to highlight something interesting. The volume I helped co-edit a few years ago, Eastern Christian Approaches to Philosophy. There's a great chapter by Andrew Hayes, and he's shown that St. Ephrem believed that the very purpose of human cognitive activity is the pursuit of wisdom. That's the purpose of our cognitive activity. And that many of his, he's also shown that many of his views on seeking wisdom anticipate themes in some postmodern philosophers, such as Marshall McLuhan. Sorry, it's a mouthful. So again, I think it's just important to not just take passages out of these patristic writers out of context and then use that to support some view that philosophy is somehow evil or wrong or incompatible with orthodoxy. Rather, it's important to really think about what are they criticizing when they make these statements? What are they actually targeting? And then also to look at their own lives and what they did, not just what they said. And of course, when you look at St. Paul and St. Gregory and St. Ephrem, these are people who are highly educated. They couldn't have written what they did without an incredible education, and who often employ concepts and themes and ideas, and they draw from pagan thinking, baptize it, and use it to articulate their unique Christian views. So I've looked at some negative aspects that you can find, kind of negative comments about philosophy in the Orthodox tradition, but there are lots of positive. So not only can we look at the example of many saints who, like I have already said, engaged in philosophy and studied philosophy, but we can look at some explicit positive statements that we see. Let's look at this remarkable statement from St. Gregory of Nyssa in his work, The Life of Moses. In his kind of allegorical interpretation of the life of Moses, he makes this interesting comment and interpretation of Exodus chapter 12, starting at verse 35. He says, Exodus 12:35 commands those participating through virtue in the free life also to equip themselves with the wealth of pagan learning by which foreigners to the faith beautify themselves. Moses, our guide in virtue, commands someone who borrows from wealthy Egyptians to receive such things as moral and natural philosophy, geometry, astronomy, dialectic, and whatever else is sought by those outside the church, since these things will be useful when in time the divine sanctuary of mystery must be beautified with the riches of reason. That's a pretty powerful pro-philosophy statement there. So St. Gregory is clearly suggesting that Christians ought to avail themselves of human wisdom, human knowledge acquired by people even outside the church, and those seeking answers to questions, whether they're philosophical or thinking about the natural sciences or mathematics or whatever. These are important things to study, to learn, and to draw upon. We have this other quote from St. John of Damascus, and it should be obvious from the beginning of this lecture that St. John is not averse to philosophy. He has an entire book explicating and explaining Aristotelian philosophy as it was interpreted by the Neoplatonists, but also carefully showing how patristic writers would take those philosophical terms and how they would slightly tweak them sometimes and reinterpret them and use them for their own purposes. So he does this before we even get to studying theology. But he also makes this comment, which I think is important. It's this explicit kind of statement affirming the importance of studying philosophy. He says, first of all, I shall set forth the best contributions of the philosophers of the Greeks, because whatever there is of good has been given to men from above by God, since every best gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. If, however, there is anything that is contrary to the truth, then it is a dark invention of the deceit of Satan and a fiction of the mind of an evil spirit. So what he's saying is that you need to avail yourselves of the good things in philosophy. Anything that's good comes from God. And if it's good, we should draw from it. We should use it. We shouldn't be afraid of it. But we should also be careful. We should use discernment. We should look for falsehoods. And we should obviously set those aside. So we need to be careful and discerning when we're drawing upon philosophy and using philosophy. But we also need to not just throw it all out just because there are going to be some falsehoods and there are going to be things that are incorrect. And finally, let's return to St. Gregory Palamas. In that work, Philosophy Does Not Save, he doesn't just speak negatively about philosophy. He actually says this: is there then anything of use to us in this philosophy? Certainly. For just as there is much therapeutic value even in substances obtained from the flesh of serpents, and the doctors consider there is no better and more useful medicine than that derived from this source, so there is something of benefit to be had even from the profane philosophers, but somewhat as in a mixture of honey and hemlock. So it is most needful that those who wish to separate out the honey from the mixture should beware that they do not take the deadly residue by mistake. So again, this is actually significant. It may at first sound still like a half-hearted assertion that philosophy is important, that we should avail ourselves of pagan learning, but it's actually a bit more positive than you think. He's talking about the therapeutic value. He uses this analogy, this idea of doctors obtaining some kind of medicinal value from extracting, something from a serpent. Maybe you can think about antivenom today to put it in more contemporary context. And how that can be therapeutic, that can save a life. And so that's actually quite a positive statement about how useful philosophy can be if it's used well, if it's used with discernment, remembering, and he uses this other example of it being kind of like a mixture of honey, something sweet, nourishing, with poison, the hemlock, and how we have to be careful to separate those things. So he's not saying philosophy is bad, philosophy is evil, all of it's terrible, don't use it, right? It's not compatible with the faith. Rather, we have to use discernment when we use philosophy. And actually, when it's used well, it can be really good. It can be life-saving. It can be a healing balm. It can help. It can be used for the service of theology. In fact, he does use it for theology all throughout his writing. And he's really, again, as I pointed out, concerned with this extreme kind of view that someone might take, where they say that, well, by philosophy, we can achieve salvation. And that's the same kind of view that St. Paul is really responding to. Philosophy does not get you to salvation. And the gospel message isn't just some cool new philosophical idea. So, excuse me one second. Sorry about that. I'm using my phone as a camera, so I didn't think about the fact someone might try to call me in my lecture. All right, so let's conclude the lecture with what is Orthodox philosophy. I think hopefully, I've established that philosophy is an important part of the tradition, and that it shouldn't be something that we completely ignore. And actually, it's something that's good, that can be useful if used with discernment. So what is Orthodox philosophy? What does it look like to be an Orthodox philosopher? I'm still thinking about that myself as an Orthodox philosopher, but here's some things presented in no particular order that I've come up with to help answer this question. First, I think Orthodox philosophy is grounded in the church, or at least it ought to be. That is, it should be rooted in the holy tradition. And this is not a straitjacket that prevents us from creative thinking. It's not slavishly just repeating things that have been said in the past, but rather the church should provide us, and it does provide us, with an existential, spiritual, and dogmatic foundation from which we can then embark on a creative pursuit of knowledge. From within the church, we have the saints' experience of God and their accounts of those experiences. We have the Holy Scriptures. We have our prayers and the liturgy. We have the church fathers and mothers. We have the councils and dogmatic definitions of our faith. We have all of this richness. And not only that, it should be something that as an Orthodox philosopher that we're steeped in, not just book learning, but actually spiritually engaging with that. So we should be praying, we should be encountering God. And it's from that we can embark on this creative pursuit of knowledge as Orthodox Christians. And working from that base, that foundation, and in the midst of it, from within the church, this provides us with the guardrails to help protect us from falling into errors that lead us to spiritual decay and death. So those kind of errors that folk like St. Gregory Palamas, St. Paul, and St. Ephraim are concerned about can be avoided if we're doing philosophy, pursuing knowledge from the context of being in the church, actively participating in the life of the church, and building off of that amazing foundation we have of thousands of years of experience and of philosophical reflection and theological reflection and of our, of our dogma and all of that. Second, I think Orthodox philosophy ought to be aimed at the truth. Think about what St. John begins with. He talks about pursuing knowledge is not, in his view, it's not just some kind of fun pastime or, something you sit around and have debates about, but it's the aim and goal is to uncover true answers to these questions we have. It's not just some self-indulgent cultivation of cleverness or word games or about winning arguments. That's really important. A true Orthodox philosophy is not just about looking smart, winning arguments against people and opponents. That's not really what philosophy is about. Rather, it's about a genuine, earnest pursuit of knowledge and trying to answer those questions. And therefore, it should be rooted in logic and good critical thinking. But further, it should be born out of intellectual virtue. So Orthodox philosophers should be cultivating intellectual virtues like charity to our opponents, people we might disagree with, who have different answers to some of these important questions that we're trying to find answers to. Humility, recognizing that we make errors, that we can have biases, that we can commit fallacies in our own reasoning, we have blind spots. Out of love for other persons, essentially. So everything we should do as Orthodox Christians should be out of love of neighbor, love of God, ultimately. And we can't love God without loving our neighbor. So doing philosophy should be in that spirit, in the spirit of truth, in the spirit of love of neighbor, cultivating intellectual virtue, because you can be very logical and you can have really, sweet syllogisms that are, formally valid and all this stuff, and you can sound very clever. But if you're not cultivating intellectual virtues, then you still might actually yourself miss the truth. You may get the wrong answers, or you may also harm others. You may prevent them from discovering the truth by your behavior. So those two things are really important. And finally, I think Orthodox philosophers should not be afraid of non-Christian philosophy or science. We don't need to be afraid of it if we're working as philosophers from within the church, and this activity of seeking knowledge and understanding of the world around us is grounded in this foundation of the lived experience of the church and its worship and its sacraments and the Holy Scriptures and the teachings of the church. Then we don't need to be afraid of trying to seek knowledge and understanding of the world. We should be open to learning from the many good things that science or philosophy, these fields of inquiry, have to offer. Of course, exercising caution and discernment, but caution and discernment is not the same as fear. Fear can be crippling, and fear can prevent you from exploring those things, in which case you won't find the good in them, the good things that St. John of Damascus and St. Gregory Palamas are encouraging us to look for and draw upon. The good, beautiful things that St. Gregory of Nyssa is saying can enrich our faith. If we have fear, we will miss out on those things. And if we're working from within the church and we're aimed at truth and we're cultivating intellectual virtue and using the tools of reasoning, working from the context of the church, then we don't need to be afraid of these non-Christian ideas and fields of inquiry. In fact, we might find that there's a lot there to draw upon, and in imitation of the whole patristic tradition that's so important to our church, we can draw upon that to try to answer new questions that are pressing and important, contemporary issues that we need to respond to as Orthodox Christians and thinkers. And we have an obligation to, I think, as philosophers who are Orthodox Christians. There's a lot more to be said about what does Orthodox philosophy look like, what is Orthodox philosophy. But I think that this is a pretty good start. And these are some important concepts that need to be there, and however we answer that question. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate you taking time to watch and listen to this lecture. And I hope you'll join me again in the future. Hopefully once a month, I will plan on doing one of these lectures and covering other interesting topics that relate to how philosophy relates to Orthodox theology. If you enjoyed this and you'd like to, please consider making a small donation or even becoming a regular supporter of the channel. I would really appreciate that. All right. Have a good evening.